This happened in the early years of my marriage before we had children. My husband and I were real travel enthusiasts back then, so we would try to go on at least 2 trips per year. It was tough to plan all that around both of our jobs and other family commitments. But it was important to both of us, so we put in the effort and managed to see some of the greatest spots in the world. One of these trips was to Miami, Florida. Not exactly the most exotic destination for us, since we lived in Jacksonville, but we were excited nonetheless. This was right around the time when Airbnb started to get more popular, and we were looking forward to trying it out. Hotels are nice, but they tend to be the same everywhere. There was something a little more exciting about renting an actual house in the city where we would be exploring. The place we settled on was a 1-bedroom unit on the main floor of an older house. The place was split up into several different apartments. All of them were available for rent on Airbnb as well. It looked nice based on the pictures, and the neighborhood had a quaint charm. The kind of charm you just can't get from staying in a hotel. We booked it for just 2 nights, since it was going to be a quick weekend trip. When the weekend came, my husband and I made the long drive from Jacksonville to Miami. We had taken the afternoon off work so we could arrive at a reasonable hour, since it was about a 5-hour drive. I texted the owner when we were about 30 minutes from the house. He was going to give us the keys in person. I've stayed at Airbnbs since then, and they have a whole system where you can get the keys without seeing anyone in person, but things had not become that sophisticated yet. When we arrived in the neighborhood, I was slightly disappointed. The quaint charm that I was expecting turned out to look more run down than anything else. We arrived at the house, and the owner was waiting on the porch. We got out of the car and walked over to him. He was an older man, probably mid-50s. Tall and thin, with a bald top of the head and long gray hair at the sides. At least a few days' worth of stubble was on his face, creating the beginnings of a gray beard. He seemed friendly enough, though. We exchanged small talk for a few minutes before he gave us the keys. One thing that struck me as odd was that he actually lived in our unit, but would rent it out occasionally for extra money. Surprised by this, my husband asked him where he would stay, but he just brushed off the question with some non-answer like,
"Oh, don't worry about me,"
or,
"I'll be fine."
I will have to admit that I did worry about him a little bit. How strapped for cash would you need to be to rent out your own home on Airbnb? I doubt he was able to find anything significantly cheaper than what we were paying. Unless he had a friend or family member to stay with, then it really didn't make any sense. We took the keys anyway, and waved politely as he left. It was still around 6 p.m., so we went out to dinner and then went for a walk at the waterfront. We had all but forgotten about the strange owner while we took in the beauty of the city at night. At around 10 p.m., we decided to call it a night. It had been a long day with the drive, so we were eager to get some sleep. I climbed the 3 or 4 stairs up to the porch and unlocked the front door. My husband and I stepped in and closed the door behind us. Then we went to the bedroom. I fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. In the middle of the night, I was awoken by my husband shaking my shoulders. He whispered in my ear, "Wake up, there's someone in the house." I sat up, and I could hear the footsteps of at least 2 people outside the door of the bedroom. We quickly got up and pushed the dresser in front of the door and sat in front of it using our weight to reinforce the barricade. Not more than 10 seconds later, someone started banging on the door, trying to open it. They didn't say anything though. I wanted to call the police, but our phones were out of reach, and we were afraid that if either of us left, then the other would not be able to hold the door closed. We sat there in a deadly stalemate for another minute before I shouted, "What do you want? Get out of here!" As soon as the words left my lips, the banging stopped. I could hear whispering on the other side of the door, but I couldn't tell what they were saying. Then, they just left. The fading sounds of their footsteps was music to my ears. As soon as we were sure that they were gone, my husband called the police. When they arrived, we told them what had happened and that we were unable to give them a description of the men. As it turned out, the police were familiar with the owner of this house. He's had some trouble with the law, and it's known in the community that he has a bad drug habit. I'm not sure if they were supposed to tell us that, but they did. My guess as to what happened is that the owner of that place owed money to the wrong people, and that night, they came to either get the money or do something to him. When they heard the voice of a young woman behind the door, they must have realized that he wasn't there and left. We were pretty upset with the owner for what he did to us. We left him a 1-star review, which I think is too generous. Unfortunately for him, that is not his biggest problem. I used to have a 2-bedroom apartment with my best friend from college. It had been a few years since we graduated, but we were still living together in the place that we shared while we were studying. It was in a great location in the downtown core of the city where we lived. Unfortunately, our friendship eventually deteriorated for reasons I'd rather not get too deep into. Let's just say that we let a girl come between us. It's a shame when things like that happen, but it did cause the end of our relationship as friends and as roommates. Therefore, he decided to move out. This left me with a 2-bedroom place that I could not afford on my own. I considered getting another roommate, but once I started looking into Airbnb, it seemed like the better option. I did the math and found out that if I kept the room rented half the time, I would bring in more money than having a full-time roommate. This would mean a little more work on my end. I would need to make sure that there were always clean sheets and towels for my guests. I also figured that I'd have to be a little tidier than I'm used to, otherwise I might get a bad rating. However, I also figured it would be exciting to have a new roommate every couple days. There might be some interesting people coming through. Maybe some travelers from other countries. It could be fun. I set up my profile on the site and uploaded several pictures of the apartment. It wasn't long before people started booking the room. That was not surprising because I had set the price a little lower than what others were charging in the area. Things were great for a while. I had some wonderful experiences with several of my guests. One was a backpacker from Australia, and he was a lot of fun. I was 24 at the time, so I was still into the whole party scene. However, things took a dark turn when a new guest moved in. He arrived on a Sunday morning. I'd gotten up early to do a load of laundry and get the room ready. At around 10 a.m., I heard a knock at the door. I opened it and was met by my new roommate for the next few days. His name was Jeremy, and he was a few years older than me. 30 years old, I think. He was a normal-looking guy, average height, short hair, and a few tattoos. His clothes were dirty, and he seemed to need a shower, but it was not unbearable. One thing that struck me about him were his eyes. They had a look like he was always angry. Even though he was smiling, his eyes told a different story. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back now, I wish I had. We made awkward small talk for several minutes before I showed him to his room. As soon as I left him alone, he closed the door and didn't open it for the rest of the day. Over the next few days, I didn't see much of Jeremy. He seemed to sleep pretty much all day and night, only leaving to eat and use the bathroom. He was cordial when we crossed paths, but I did find his presence unsettling. It seemed like he was hiding something. However, it was none of my business. He would be leaving soon, so I figured the best course of action was just to wait it out. I might even get a good review, I thought. On his last night, Jeremy was in his room like usual, and I was in the living room. The news was on the TV, which I was half watching while scrolling through Instagram on my phone. I happened to look up at the television when the news reporter was talking about an armed robbery that took place earlier in the week on the other side of town. It was a pretty serious crime because somebody was actually shot. My stomach dropped when they showed a picture of the main suspect. It was Jeremy. Worried that he might have heard the report from his room, I quickly changed the channel. I sat in a state of panic for several seconds, trying to organize my thoughts. Then I grabbed my phone and left the apartment immediately. The most important thing was for me to get away from him, then I could call the police. I walked down the street several blocks and dialed 911. Within 5 minutes, my apartment building was surrounded by 5 or 10 police cars. I stood on the other side of the street watching as they escorted Jeremy into the back of one of the police cruisers. For a split second, he noticed me and we made eye contact. His glare tore through me and actually made me regret calling the police. I followed the case through the news and found out that Jeremy got 5 to 10 years in prison. A light sentence for what he did, in my opinion. That's 5 to 10 years before he's out on the street again. There's no doubt that he knows what I did. I'm terrified every day of what he might do when he's free again. My family and I rented a house on Airbnb for an out-of-town wedding a few years ago. There were 8 of us that were going to be staying there, so all in all, it was a lot cheaper than staying at a hotel. We arrived on Saturday at around noon. The owner had texted me the combination to a lockbox that was bolted to the outside of the house. My uncle entered the combination and handed out a few sets of keys. I think there were 3 sets of keys total, so we would have to share. The first day was the rehearsal for the wedding. I won't go into much detail about that since it's not important to the story. After it was over, we had a small party at the house. My family doesn't get together often, so we used this as an opportunity to catch up and have a few drinks. Everyone had called it a night by around 11:30. It was a long day. Some of us had a long drive and were up early to make it there on time. My parents and my aunts and uncles took the bedrooms upstairs, while my cousin Julie and I slept on the couches in the living room on the main floor. I had set my alarm for 8:30 a.m. the next day, since there was quite a bit of work to do before the rest of the guests arrived. I woke up the next morning, my alarm ringing. I could hear people walking around in the house. I reached over to my phone and turned the alarm off. That was when I noticed how aggressive the footsteps sounded on the floorboards upstairs. It sounded like someone was angry. At first, my thought was that someone had gotten into a fight. My parents never fight, but I don't know all my aunts and uncles that well, so maybe. That was what I thought until I reached over for my backpack, and it was gone. Someone had taken it. Just then, my Uncle Jerry stomped down the stairs and burst into the living room. "Mike, Julie, call the cops. We've been robbed," he shouted. I reached over and grabbed my phone, then dialed 911. I also texted the owner of the house to let him know what had happened. He lived close by, so he drove right over. The police arrived not long after. The owner actually had an exterior camera that was on a motion sensor, so he came prepared to show that to the police. A few of us gathered around his phone and watched as 2 dark figures casually walked up to the door at 2 a.m. and opened it. He had a key. We figured that a previous guest had copied the key and kept it in order to rob future guests. Not the smartest plan, in my opinion. The owner said that he recognized one of the guys and gave his info to the police. This led to his arrest several days later, and we did actually get our stuff back eventually. The wedding, however, was pretty awkward. None of us had our suits or dresses since they were stolen at the time. We went anyway in plain clothes. There was no sense in letting this ruin the occasion. Creepy as it is to think of that guy lurking around the house while we were sleeping, the pictures from the wedding actually are kind of funny.